Right. So I used to think that if I had a good product, I could make something great that people would buy it and I could make money as a business person, all this kind of stuff, right? And then I learned how to make things. I got better at my skills and such. And I figured out that the product alone is not the main part of business. Then I started to learn about more social media, the idea of advertising things and networking, connecting, and all this stuff. And to be honest, I'm really not good at that part. But I used to think that was the most important part. That if you're good at just selling, if you have a product and you can figure out how to sell it, and it's like that's the path of success, right? In business. Then I figured out that's not the most important part. Now I'm starting to see the dome, the head, the top, which is essentially a part of it, which is law, regulation, restrictions, governmental, legal stuff, right? And I'm starting to think this is the most important part. So if you're trying to make a company or a product or a service, business, or whatever it is, try to understand the legal parts that go into it and also think about how do I structure my business first in a legal, proper way? Because of course, we want to be right tax-wise, we want to be right law-wise, morally, of course. I think if you always act in a moral way, things will work out better, but people could still try to sue you, people could still try to, take advantage of you legally and all these kinds of things. So it's good to think about first, how can you properly act legally? Now, these are, of course, just my thoughts and opinions. I'm not a master in this stuff, so, take this with a grain of salt. But firstly, of course, we have the idea of a sole trader or like a personal self-business, and then a LLC, a company, like a real company, a real business, which is a legally liable company, right? And the difference between these is that you take on all the legal responsibility as yourself if it's a sole trader or a personal business. If it's an LLC, like a company, the company is its own legal entity. An important thing to realize is that countries are essentially legal entities. They're companies. People ourselves function as legal entities. And then, like companies, we are essentially a company, a person is. And there's a lot of stuff you can look into that. And then a company is, of course, its own company as well. So all these things are like legally liable in different ways. So that's the reason why, if you kind of start out with a sole trader, but then eventually you get to the point where if you want to release something and you could be legally liable, then you have to move into a company because you can't risk like hundreds of thousands or millions or whatever of fines or to yourself, then you're going to be paying it all back with personal assets, and that's really not a good thing, right? Or you're just going to have debt for the rest of your life. So you have to think about this stuff. Now, anyway, we think about, I don't know, like an apples business, right? You sell apples. What are the legal risks of selling apples? And of course, this is country to country, it's going to be different, but you'd think health risks, if the apples go rotten and they make someone sick, you could be legally liable. So of course, could you add a disclaimer where if a client eats an apple, they are legally liable to their own, risks and damages and all this kind of stuff. It's a bit why certain places they'll get you to sign a legal liability what do they call piece of paper essentially that says like you will take on all the legal responsibility risks in case of damage and danger and such, and people can still try to sue even if you have signed that. There's all kinds of things that can happen, but that's essentially one thing, right? So you have to try to think about how to reduce risk legally. And of course, one thing is getting people to agree to take it on themselves. Secondarily is if you look through the law and you try to thin down as much risk. Certain countries have a lot of risk when it comes to hiring people or firing people or when it comes to being landlording, like owning property and leasing it out, or especially when it comes to health. And of course, if you're manufacturing, you have to look into things like pollution, etc. So if you made a manufacturing business, you'd want to make one that was very reducing of pollution. It's why you don't see a lot of actual manufacturing or resource processing, because it's very, like, legally, I guess it's expensive. You've got to pay a bunch of things, and you've got to be very careful with disposal of all this kind of stuff. So you end up seeing a lot of these manufacturing companies eventually just turning into importers of foreign goods. If you've ever gone to a factory district, that's a lot of these companies. They just import stuff. They have a warehouse, and then their warehouse, it operates as like a sales business, essentially, to connect to clients. They have salespeople, and then they ship it out and all that kind of stuff, right? So their liabilities is essentially they have to deal with importing taxes, any legal issues to get it to them. They also have to deal with the ID, like restricted goods. They can't have any restricted goods. And then they have to deal with, obviously, taxes, like and goods and service taxes and all these kinds of things, which are important to the government and all that stuff. And then they have to deal with shipping of it out, right? So and they could pass it off to another company, a delivery company, or they could do it in-house. And what I'm saying is every single step, so from receiving the good, sending the good, or if it's manufacturing, to receiving the raw product, or extracting the raw product, to refining the raw product into refined product, to manufacturing the refined product into a good, to shipping the good, there's like points of vulnerability and points of legal dispute, essentially. And of course, if you do any kind of improper business, just say you're over promising and you're lying, you're all kinds of stuff, right? This is layering on more issue, which is, you don't want that. So we reduce issue, we reduce risk as much as possible, and again, you have to look into and tie it to the law so that you can function in a way which completely reduces the risk. I said, if you bring in employees, you're taking on that risk, and you can essentially get them to sign things. But also, if you get bigger, then you're going to have some kind of insurance for them, right? Some kind of thing which basically says, we will cover a certain amount, but like a certain amount is also covered by you. And then it's, give or take, depending on what courts want to argue with and such. So there's, like, depending, I guess, on the size and the scale, will depend on how much you're willing to take on. If you're making a lot of money, then you can take on a little more, right? And deal more with the in-house such. So anyway, I hope that gives you some ideas on this. Essentially, all I'm saying is you have to think very long-term. You have to think very practically. Businesses are like entities, and other businesses could try to sue you for copyright and all this kind of stuff, right? Just to screw with you. Just say, if you're doing something innovative and they are in the same kind of area, they could just sue you, overwhelm you with court cases and court and legal fees and such. So it's like the law can act like a weapon for companies, where big companies can screw over smaller companies, and you have to be very careful about that. That's why you have to be very tight, so that you don't end up having to go bankrupt or pay a bunch of legal fees. And as I said, the reason you make a company is so that if a big company sees you as a sole trader that's a threat, all they need to do is take you into a court, essentially, and get you fined or whatever. And then you, as an actual entity, will take on all that debt, and you can't, I don't know, can you bankrupt yourself as a person? I think there's some things you can do, but I'm not sure, actually. It really wouldn't be a good thing, right? That'd be like, good 5 years of time out, 5-10 years or whatever. So that's why, people hide behind companies, but then it's like you don't want your company to go under if it's providing a good service and if it's like paying your bills and if you're doing a good thing, right? But you have to realize, there are sharks in the water and they can throw hundreds of thousands, even millions at you just for fun, just because it's like entertaining, right? And it could be difficult to fight that, right? And expensive. So just be very careful about all this stuff and always think long term and always think in a legal, proper way that is very tight to the earth, I guess. So anyway, I hope that helps.